Hello, and welcome to I'm a Fan of That, a podcast about all things fandom, told through objects, stories, and studies, with a bit of silliness thrown in along the way. Your hosts on this journey are Dr. Vivian Asimos, public anthropologist and pop culture academic, and me, pop culture writer and journalist, all-round enthusiast, Holly Swinyard. Join us as we deep dive into the wonderful and wacky world of fan culture, its history, the people who make it up, and the way we look at this ever-growing part of our society. Fair warning, we may well talk about some adult themes, use some adult language, and possibly get a bit nerdy about the whole thing. You have been warned.
Hello, I'm Vivian Asimos.
And I'm Holly Swinyard.
And welcome to I'm a Fan of That, where we talk about the wonderfully complicated worlds of fandom through the objects we love. So today, this is another one that I don't have.
We're in the imaginary realm.
I don't know if you can buy it, but I'm sure you could. I haven't looked into it. I should, because it would be rad.
Maybe we need to make one.
Well, I will leave that in your far more capable hands. But I want you to imagine a mask that only covers, like, your eye shape. Like one of those, like, classic superhero masks that are, like, only covering the eyes.
Like Zorro.
Under, it's all fringe.
Okay, yeah.
That comes
I think I know what you're
down
talking
and
about.
covers your face.
Yes.
This is the mask of Orville Peck.
Okay.
And I am obsessed with Orville Peck. Anyone that's been following me for at least a little bit will know I wrote a blog post about him. I have a video essay about him. I will not shut up about him. And he probably has me on some kind of watch list. But I talked about him with a friend of mine, and he hadn't listened to his music yet, but then was immediately like, if he ever tours in the UK, we're going. Just because Orville Peck also looks like he really puts on a good show. But anyway, I should explain a little bit about who we're talking about.
So I have seen him mostly through like the drag community. Like, I know that there are some of the drag queens who've been on like RuPaul's Drag Race who have done shows with him or are friends with him in some way. So I've kind of seen that a little bit, but I also don't know very much about him. I have been recommended some songs by you and also by my other half to go and listen to, but I haven't had a moment to get around to it because I'm writing a book at the moment and therefore literally have no time to do anything ever. I can't listen to music and write a book. I'm not one of those people.
Oh, we are so different. I have a writing playlist, and there's a couple of Orville Peck songs on there, but sometimes I'll just put on one of his albums and just go through it as I write. But yeah, so Orville Peck is a singer, if you couldn't get that gist from the conversation. He's South African born. I think he's currently based in Canada, but, you know, with, like, famous people, they probably jump around all over the place. And he is an openly gay country singer. And he also kind of has his form of country, I should specify, isn't that, like, bro country that's really in right now. Yeah. It's really, like, actual old school. It reminds me a lot of, like, Ray Orbison and Johnny Cash.
Yeah. Old school, proper kind of, like, almost gritty, visceral kind of stuff.
He's got a beautiful voice, and it really fits that style really well. So he's like that type of country.
Because I know I'm a big fan of, I love folk music in the UK in general, but I'm a big fan of bluegrass as well, and I know there's a massive movement in bluegrass to kind of sort of reclaim its roots and like open it up to more people and kind of be like, lots of people think of bluegrass as like, you talk about that sort of bro country, that kind of as a very kind of white American thing, and they're like, well, it kind of, it's not, it's very working class, it's very, you know, it should be for everybody. And I know that there's a movement there, as there is in British folk and Irish folk music, to be more inclusive, and so that kind of feels like this is on sort of the edge of that. But I know that American country, or general country music in general, is quite resistant to that sort of stuff.
Yeah, America in general is more resistant to that kind of stuff.
I mean, I will bow to your knowledge on that one.
But no, I picked up Orville Peck when I had already moved to the UK because he's relatively new. I think his first album, Pony, came out in like 2017 or something like that. So I was already long in this country by then. So I don't know as much about how the US, like, feet on the ground is picking him up. But but I know that particularly the LGBT community have really grabbed onto him for obvious reasons. He's openly gay. His first album, Pony, was all about being gay and the experiences of being gay. And when I was listening to Pony for the first time, there was that moment of I was going, this style of country that is all about honesty, and it's typically really depressing music when you like really go back into it. I mean, like Dolly Parton is just like,
oh yeah,
like,
I mean, like
on.
so my father, big fan of all of this sort of stuff, is kind of the reason, and so is my mum as well. It's kind of the reason why I'm into it. But I remember him once saying to me, you know, all folk music, whether you're talking country or like folk as a general umbrella term, is about sex, death, and drinking. That's your choice. Maybe some taxes if you're in the kind of newer stuff, but like that's your general thing, and it will be horrendously depressing at some point. You'll be like, this is very jolly. Yeah. Oh, this song is about murdering people. Oh, okay. So just to give people an idea, I went to see 3 weeks after I'd had my very large surgery. I went to go and see the Bellowhead Revival Tour, because love nor money nor wild horses could keep me from that tour. And my other half is there, like, literally kind of trying to restrain me from dancing. Like, come back, your chest has been cut open, come back. You know, like, so, you know, I love this sort of music. I don't know why I haven't listened to him. I'm kind of starting to be like, this feels like I should be getting on the strange, quirky country music vibe. Yeah,
you would definitely love him. I think some of my other friends, I have to kind of be like, he's country, but not that kind of country, like an actual good country, but you don't know that good country because you don't listen to it, so I have to like explain that this good country exists.
Look, if you throw a kazoo in there, it's going to be very exciting. That's all I'm saying.
But yeah, so it was one of those things where the first time I heard him, I was like, it makes so much sense for the gay experience and the LGBT experience to match with this style of music and the experience of being closeted and how that feels, and that depression and the coming out and how that changes the way that other people may or may not perceive you, and the hurt that might happen when people suddenly change the way they feel about you when you come out. There's a song that he has on that first album where he talks about when he was still closeted and meeting other people that were closeted, and that weird experience that you have where you kind of know without it being told. And one of the lines is that June looks the same in your eyes, which is obviously the Pride Month. And it was just like that, you know, it's just it's beautiful writing. He has absolutely beautiful writing.
I feel like I'm going to listen to this and I'm going to be a sobbing mess by the end of this
definitely
album. Pony. And I'll be like, Vivian, why would you do this to me?
Definitely Pony is one of those albums that it's just like, if you want a good cry, if you need that in your life at a certain point, and I think it hits you a lot differently if you are LGBT, but like, I do think there are some elements of it that even if you're not, you could probably connect to. But if you need a good cry, just put on Pony and just lay down and let it wash over you, because it's so good. Bronco, which came out last year, so it was very new, and I listened to it nonstop for most of the year. And that one has a little bit more of an upbeat thing, and that one is also a little bit more about just depression more generally, rather than it being specifically tied to being gay. But obviously there is still that in there, because it's hard. You can't separate that part of yourself when you're talking about your own experiences and your own feelings.
And I think particularly in like country music, in the same way as in like the blues or, you know, any of these kinds of very quite visceral kind of, they come from a very specific place, that is very much at the heart of it. Like you're talking about, like a lot of country and a lot of bluegrass, when you go back to it, is talking about, you know, basically working yourself to death because you don't have a choice about it and all this sort of stuff. Like when you're kind of looking into those things, they're working songs, they're miners' songs, they're, you know, the songs of sailors and all this sort of stuff. They're people who are in a situation that can be utterly uplifting, but also like the pits of despair could happen there as well. And I think that is a very similar feeling to like being LGBT. You can be like, this is the best thing ever, we're having the best time, it's Pride and we're all here and we're having a happy time. And then there are other moments when you're like, oh, this is so difficult and I can't, you know, get my way through it and all that kind of way, you know?
Yeah.
You're right, it links those feelings of where this type of music comes from, and particularly since obviously a lot of it also comes from the black community. You're talking about people who are suffering in one way or another and trying to find either some joy or some relief in it. And it totally makes sense for a gay man to want to use that type of music as a way of describing his own experience.
He's talked in interviews about how he always really loved the honesty that is associated with country music writing. That all of country music writing, at least, again, those kind of, that type of country, it was always, like you were saying, it was from the soul, it was from the personal experience, it was from the personal pain. And there's something, when you're listening to that type of music, that really speaks to it. You know, there is something that it doesn't feel manufactured in it, because there's something so authentic in the way that it comes across. And so again, when you are of a similar community and you're listening to it, you can really connect to what it is that they're saying. Yeah. It's one of the reasons why I've always really liked Dolly Parton music. So he talks a lot about that authentic stuff and things like that. And yet he wears a mask.
Yeah, I was about to ask about that. So like, this is music that is deeply personal and authentic and relatable and all that kind of stuff, but he's physically hiding himself the whole time. Yes. Like, has he ever in interviews shown his face, or is it entirely like there's this character of him?
I believe he has never. There's rumors about who he is, and it's pretty much known who he is, because like the tattoos match up some of the stories that he doesn't like hide elements of himself in interviews. Like, he's openly talked about like where he went to school or when he did something over here or lived in this area, and people have been able to match it up with what they know of somebody else. And so I think he used to be in a punk band before being Orville Peck. But I think there's something really beautifully paradoxical about what's happening that I think some people might think of as being antithetical to what he's saying, and yet I personally think it almost reinstitutes what he's saying. I've talked a lot about Orville Peck's mask in other places, so I'm not going to spend like a massive amount of time talking about it, but there's this idea of mask performances, and so I've studied a lot of myth and myth performance and the way that myths are told in a variety of different ways. And obviously those kind of really traditional performances come into that. And often people would don masks for it.
So like in ancient Greece, you put the mask on.
Yeah. Native Americans do it. You know, pick a culture, they have a mask dance. Like, it's gonna happen. Yeah. But basically there's been work on masks that talk about how... David Napier, I think, is the one that primarily talked about it, that a mask is the thing that lays on the boundary between the self and the other. So you are the self, and then when you are becoming the other, you put on the mask, and the mask is that point where you transform or that you become the other. It becomes, the mask itself becomes a type of play, essentially, where you are balancing between this idea of yourself versus what the other is. You're the human versus divine, if you want to take it that more traditional way. Basically, when you are doing it, you kind of need to overcome this boundary in order to kind of meld the two worlds. Yeah. And what I see happening in Orville Peck is that the mask is in some way this kind of idea of the other that is typically put on to the LGBT community. Yeah. And by donning it, he's essentially taking a hold of that in a way and transforming it, and in a way of doing it that allows other people to also put on the mask.
Yeah, because I was thinking it kind of feels a bit like what he's doing is creating a vessel, a sort of a thing that anyone can project themselves onto. Like, if anybody could put on that mask, anyone would be this person. You know, it kind of feels a bit like he could, as much as obviously it's his music and it's his story and all that kind of stuff, he could pass that mask to another person and they could be Orville Peck. And it's almost like a vessel of an item that is able for anybody listening to the music to kind of see themselves in, to put themselves in that position, because it's not, while it is his personal experience, it kind of mutes the self a little bit. Like, you can't see this person's face, you literally can't, and so it could be your face. It's a bit like, I've always really liked the as much as parody, the book Masquerade by Terry Pratchett. Will Ollie talk about Terry Pratchett every single episode? Possibly. Where there's two characters pretending to be the same person throughout the whole thing, and nobody can work out, like, people kind of guess one or they guess the other, but they never guess that it's both, because clearly it's one person wearing the mask. Like, it could only be one person wearing the mask. And by the end you're like, oh, so two people were pretending to be this one thing. And, like, it kind of feels like the mask is transferable, right? So you can move it across people, and they both, however many people, become that one person. Like, isn't that the whole point of the Mask of Zorro, that he passes the mask down to Antonio Banderas' character, Anthony Hopkins, and then he's Zorro, you know, like, it's why I always find it a bit weird when people are like, no one could be Batman except Bruce Wayne. I'm like, except anybody who puts on the mask can be Batman. Like, that's the entire point.
Yeah,
but
it becomes something to kind of aim for, in a way. And I think that's one of, I mean, as much as it is in some way, I think, a costume gimmick, I think it is a lot more than a costume gimmick. And I think it's something that Orville Peck has probably thought about in that sense, of the importance of putting that on and what that means for other people.
I think there's a lot to be said for the fact that the mask, I like lots of performers wear helmets or masks or stuff, right? Like, famously Daft Punk wear helmets so you can't see their face, so that the music become, the characters and the music and the performance become what's important, not the people behind it. And I think it maybe is an attempt, I don't know if it's successful with every single artist, but it's an attempt to make the music and the story of the music more its own thing. Everyone can talk about Beyonce or Taylor Swift and all that sort of stuff, and they're like, oh, who's this, particularly with Taylor Swift, and we will talk about this at some point, but who's this song about, what's she referencing, what's she talking, all this kind of stuff, because everybody knows everything about her life. Even if people kind of have guessed who Orville Peck is, there is a physical barrier of, like, well, he's chosen to not be that person, so people, I don't know if people would do the same thing.
One of the things that I really like about the fans of Orville Peck is that as much as we kind of know who he most likely is, that's not really that important. Like, it's not chased up, it's not talked about of, like, oh, are you gonna finally admit you're this person, or an attempt at subterfuge on his part in regards to it. It's just, there's this understanding that who he actually is when he takes off the mask isn't what matters.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's really cool about it. And yet, as we said, he's been talking about his music is so deeply personal. In a similar way to Taylor Swift, and we'll talk about that when we get to Taylor Swift, that Taylor Swift has a country background and therefore takes on board a lot of that authentic personal experience writing. But yet, it is always so entirely tied to Taylor Swift as a person, which is interesting in and of itself.
Yeah.
But what Orville Peck manages to do is to spin it to reflect on his whole community. And his music becomes stories about the LGBT community rather than about Orville Peck.
Because I'd wonder whether he considered that when he was doing it, or whether it was a sort of happy coincidence that it has happened, or whether it was very intentional to be like, I want to be this vessel for the community, or I want to give them more agency through my music. You know, I would be really interested to know that, because if it is intentional, then it's so well done. It's so well done. And if it's not, then it's still amazingly well done. Yeah. But what a genius accident that happened, you know? Like,
yeah. I personally suspect it's a little bit of both. I could imagine, especially if somebody used to be in a punk band, apparently a well-known one. I hadn't heard of it before, but I was reading the information about it to my partner, and he was like, oh, I know that band. So, I mean...
Okay.
So if it was a band that was fairly well known and you want to not carry that with you into another very different endeavor, that hiding your face is a really good way of doing that, and having a different name and being able to completely disassociate from that.
I mean, if you think about people like Banksy or whatever, like, that's entirely the reason why we don't know who Banksy is. I mean, I think, again, there's quite a lot of guessing about who he is, and there may well be some more obvious ones than others, but, like, that's entirely the point as well. Yes, now it's sort of, oh, it's a Banksy or whatever. We don't know anything about his background, whether he actually is a he. I mean, I'm certain,
Yeah.
you know, all that kind of stuff. Like, and so the art speaks for itself in a way that if you kind of know about the artist, it doesn't. Or I always find it really funny because my favourite thing at the moment is watching Star Wars fanboys like completely break down because Boba Fett isn't the maskless, faceless person that they wanted to project everything onto, and now he's got a personality and they're not allowed to do that so much anymore. Like, it's really interesting to see, like, you took a character who was literally, he had no face, and was super easy to project whatever you wanted onto because he was just kind of silent in the background and really cool and did stuff. Like, and then you take that away and that people really struggled with that because it was no longer a thing they could put their own wants and needs into as like a sort of, like I say, a vessel. Like, that's what it was. And it kind of feels the same thing as when people don't, when characters or people or a character created by a person for them to play is almost faceless, they become what people who relate to them need.
I've seen pictures. Unfortunately, he hasn't toured in the UK before, so I haven't been able to go see him live. And I'm not normally a big go to see people live person, but I would probably go to see Orville Peck live because it'd probably be full of wonderful LGBT people that would just have a good time. I've seen people go there wearing Orville Peck masks. I've seen people going wearing cowboy outfits, you know, to kind of embody this idea of who Orville Peck is in themselves, almost like they're cosplaying Orville Peck, but in their own way.
Yeah. Because I've seen people who are fans of celebrities kind of track down items of clothing that they've worn and all this sort of stuff in the past. But, like, this feels almost different because you're not just being like, I want to wear that thing that celebrity wore. Like, I think we've talked in the past about the whole Wagatha Christie thing and, like, people were buying the clothes and stuff. Like, craziness. Or, as we talked about with Love Island, that people were getting the clothes. But this feels like people want to... It's not that they just want to have the thing and aspire to it. It's like they kind of... They feel a connection and a camaraderie and a I could be you, you know, kind of, and not in a I want your life, I want all of this, but more like a, It's grabbing onto the spirit of it, because I think the fact that he chooses to wear cowboy outfits, because that's the other part of it. Orville Peck is a whole thing, and if you are listening and you don't know, this is the first time you're hearing of Orville Peck, Google image search him. Because, I mean, he's fabulous in his outfit choices. He's gotten, like, custom-made cowboy outfits from, like, Versace and stuff before. Like, it's insane. But it's always, like, a very traditional cowboy, like, ranchy type of outfit. Typically wearing those kind of boots. Always has the mask on. So it's always this very painted photo of a cowboy. Yeah. And it's almost masculinity to the extreme, right? The cowboy is such a heavy masculine item, like icon even, and like taking claim of that as a gay man is a really, really big thing to do. Think about like the sheer backlash that there was against things like Brokeback Mountain. And, you know, all that kind of, gay cowboys, blah, blah, blah. You know, people got so angry about it. And that here is a gay man being like, no, I'm going to claim this for me. Yeah. I'm going to do that.
And I think one of the things that's really beautiful about what he's doing is that, I mean, there's a whole mythology around the cowboy that I can get into, but I'm not going to get too deep into because it would be a whole episode in and of itself. But
that's for next season. We'll do a cowboy episode.
But historically, cowboys were typically all sorts of different people. There were gay cowboys. Definitely. It's been recorded. It's been recorded historical fact that there were gay cowboys. It's been recorded historical fact that there were black cowboys.
And wasn't it the case that most cowboys were people of colour because white people didn't want their jobs?
Exactly. It was hard work, and it was white people were the ones typically that owned the land and owned the animals, and black people would work the land. This is what it was. Yeah. There were also female cowboys, black women cowboys. Like, so this idea that has been painted primarily by Hollywood that cowboys are this epitome of white maledom is incredibly just, I mean, it's its own kind of history of the way that Americans change their narratives to fit.
Considering that the the spaghetti westerns, which are predominantly to blame for this, were direct rip-offs of Japanese samurai culture. Is in and of itself such a spectacular thing to be like, so we're going to take something from an entirely different culture and make it our own in this way, and entirely kind of the people it's come from will get less than nothing from that. You know, there's a lot to be said about that.
Yeah, but there was a lovely interview, and I probably should have like quoted it or something somewhere. I'll try to link it. But there's an interview that somebody did with Orville Peck where he talked about the cowboy, and he talked about how the cowboy is on the outskirts of society. They were people that were not necessarily brought into the fold. They were people on the outside looking in a lot of the times, and how that is how it feels to be gay, is that you are on the outskirts, and that he really talked about how the LGBT experience is the contemporary cowboy. And I think there's something really wonderful about that, reclaiming it, but not just reclaiming it from that fashion sense that he is definitely doing, but also reclaiming what it means to be a cowboy. And I think that's what's really beautiful as well.
So I've seen him compared a bit with people like Little Nas X for that kind of same thing of like the reclamation of queer male experience, and like what that looks like, what that can be, and all this sort of stuff. Like, they seem to be kind of, I wouldn't say similar because obviously they're doing very different things, but they kind of have a way of approaching things that feels quite like they're looking at. Oh, Vivian's got excited. You can't see it. She got really excited.
I just realized that, like, some kind of duet between the two of them, I would die.
Yeah. No, it would be amazing. It would be amazing.
Why hasn't that happened? You two need to do it. Do it now. I want it so bad. That would be amazing.
Yeah, but like when Montero dropped and like what that was.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and that kind of that unapologetic like reclamation of his own self in that moment was like so special. I mean, to be fair, in the same way we could talk about Taylor Swift forever, we could probably talk about Little Nas X forever. Yeah. And all these are, I'm really excited by the amount of like music artists who are kind of coming out, not coming out, but you know, are here at the moment in like the music scene, who are just kind of being like, I don't want to be this cookie cutter idea of what music is. I'm going to talk about myself, because I kind of feel like I don't know, again, people will probably be like, you're wrong, there was so and so doing this in the 2000s, but it kind of felt like we kind of went through a kind of era of very generic-y music, and that's sort of at an end now, which is great. And so there wasn't some good stuff, but like, not gonna lie, who expected Green Day to be the most controversial band of the early noughties? It wasn't me. You know, still a good album.
Well, and there you go, because that's another. I mean, the lead singer of Green Day is bi, and was openly bi at the time.
He was. It was amazing.
Was not common to have. Yeah. And so again, the history of LGBT people being the forefront of making other people uncomfortable by their sheer presence. I also
apologise because obviously My Chemical Romance exists as well. So yeah, yes, they're doing some amazing things. They've always done some really interesting things. But it, you know, there hasn't been this. I feel like this really interesting, extreme type of music for a while. And maybe, like I said, maybe that's just me. Maybe I've been living under a rock, but it's hard not to notice it now, and that's a difference, you know.
It's nice that we're at a point now where people feel more comfortable with coming out or with being famous while also having this other identity factor, and that's
a big change.
It is. I mean, Sam Smith coming out as non-binary is massive.
One of my people.
Exactly. And I don't know if that would have been possible for them, you know, 10, hell, even 5 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, even 5 years ago, like, people saying they were non-binary, that was like a thing where people were like, what the hell are you even talking about?
Yeah.
You know? One of my favourite artists is Grace Petrie. She's a protest singer, and I think it must have been 4 or 5 years ago now, she brought out a piece of music, a song called Black Tie, which is essentially about finding the clothes that fit you, finding the gender that makes sense to you, and all that kind of stuff. And when it came out, I'd been a fan of her for a long time, but it just was like, nobody's done this yet. And it wasn't even like as... It's a great song, but I wouldn't say it was anywhere near as like flamboyant or over the top as some of the ones we've seen since. So like it's cool that we're getting so many different types of music and so many different types of artists really opening up to this sort of thing. Like even I would say, as much as, you know, even people like Harry Styles, like there's a definite kind of, I guess it's not as safe and comfortable as it could be, you know?
I mean, I think people like Harry Styles, I think in a lot of ways really helps people who aren't like Harry Styles, in the sense that Harry Styles, as far as he has said, is a cis hetero man.
Yeah, and it's his choice to say whatever he wants.
Like, I mean, he might later come out differently, but at this moment in time, this is what he has identified as, so that is what I'm saying. But the fact that a cis hetero man feels comfortable to occasionally wear a skirt or occasionally wear very flamboyant clothes and is still seen in wider society, I mean, I'm sure there are certain people that disagree, but wider society still sees him as a sexually attractive cis hetero man.
Yeah, exactly. You've got people like Oscar Isaac doing that as well, and you know, turning up at like movie premieres in like the most amazing outfits. And again, he, as far as I know, is cis hetero. You know, I don't think, I have no knowledge of anything else, and that's a really big thing. You know, like that kind of.
It helps to already disrupt the gender conversation to allow more fluid identities to come out and say, actually,
gender and identity are such a spectrum that actually it's perfectly reasonable to have somebody who identifies entirely as cisgender and heterosexual to want to explore gender presentation in a different way and want to explore their own, how they feel comfortable looking. I mean, at some point I do want to talk about Finster, but like he is a perfect example. He is a guy, but he chooses to present and look very, very feminine, very, very female. And that something for him is what he's wanting to do. I mean, it's a very interesting journey, and we will do something about him at some point because he's a really interesting person. But it kind of goes to show that there isn't, you know, it doesn't have to be the most openly flamboyant queer people in community who are the only ones doing this. It could be everybody across.
Exactly. It helps to demonstrate that idea of toxic masculinity and misogyny and all this stuff impacts everybody. It's not just impacting the oppressed people. Like, I know that my partner, for example, is a cis hetero man, and yet doesn't embody a lot of those things that are very typically cis hetero, and he's had a lot of issues where, and he has talked to me, and I think it's very healthy for people to question their gender at some point in their life. I have, he has, everyone has. And the fact that he was questioning it because he was like, well, but these people are saying this is what a man is, and that's not what I am, so maybe I'm not a man.
Yeah.
And obviously he came out the other way being like, no, I'm still a man, I just don't fit these definitions. I think it shows that those identities and those ideas can negatively impact.
Yeah, and I've seen some amazing conversations from cisgender men talking about how listening and interacting and having conversations with trans men has helped them go, oh, I don't need to pass a manly test, I don't need to have a man card or anything, I just am a man because I say I am. Therefore, all of these other things are, because obviously for trans people, that's like they have these conversations, they talk about this stuff, and I think it's very healthy to be having those conversations. Like, cis people and trans people should definitely talk to each other about gender. Absolutely, categorically. Having all these conversations, thinking about them and going, oh, well, if I'm a man, then it doesn't matter if I'm not X, Y, or Z. I don't play rugby, or I don't want to go down the pub and do all the stereotypical man things that, like, you know...
Yeah.
I'd cut down some trees. I don't know.
Can I tell you the story of my friend Alan?
Yeah.
Who you have met. But he's also another not very quintessentially masculine dude. But he was meeting his wife's family, who are all very, like, manly men, and they like football and things like that. And so they were talking to Alid, and they found out that Alid doesn't like football. And they did not know what to do. And in fact, he was telling me that her sister found out. He was sitting, like, nearby, and he heard the sister, like, one of them go, oh, Alid doesn't like football. And his sister go, what does he do? What do you do or enjoy as a man that's not football? How can that be a thing?
Well, it's one of the things I actually quite like about video games is I feel like they gave people who weren't the manly men another thing that they could interact with. I mean, there are other problems with the masculinity, toxic masculinity culture around video games, but actually at the time, being able to go, oh well, you know, I don't like these particularly traditionally masculine things, but I do like this thing, and people are like, oh, okay. So it was almost like an out, you know, and now that's become interesting because it grew into a problematic thing. But it's quite there's a deep dive there to be done, I think, about and I'm sure somebody's done it because of course they have, about the kind of the way the like video game culture has grown because it was an acceptable other manly pursuit that you could have, but that wasn't football or sport or chopping down trees. Apparently, that's the only like traditionally masculine in inverted commas thing.
I do like that. I talk about my husband as if he's not this kind of quintessential manly thing, but because it doesn't look that way, and he's not interested in like football and stuff, but like he does woodworking and cool. Like all these other things. But then we'll talk about how he's not quintessential, and I'm like, you just you made a shelf and hung it up in our house for me. Like, what are you talking about?
Do you say that? My mum does that though. So
well,
it's not that manly. No, my mum is great. It's like I don't think woodwork is a manly
I was
skill.
Just
it's just a skill.
Yeah, it's just the outside perception of. Unfortunately, we are sometimes very heteronormative in my. I don't want to swing a hammer, and him doing it. But
to be fair, I sent a picture the other day where it wasn't the other day. It was in lockdown. It was a very long time ago. My perception of time is completely been destroyed by lockdown. Of me taking down some shelves and like ready to do some DIY, and I sent it to my partner like, look, I can do DIY, I'm so manly. Like really tongue-in-cheek, and they were just like, yes, well done, you use the screwdriver.
Yeah,
I did use a screwdriver.
I took a picture of him hanging up the shelves, and I'm like, see, this is why I married somebody, so that way someone could do this. And I showed it to my husband, and he was just like, I'm just screwing a thing into another thing, it's really not that hard.
I feel like we've gone completely off topic.
Yes, sorry. One of the things that I find really fascinating about Orville Peck, and The Mask as a more amorphous example of this, is the power of LGBT communal storytelling. Yes. And I think, despite the fact that Orville Peck is an individual person telling a story about his own personal narratives, and then that's just out in the world, there is a certain sense of communal narrative going on there that I find really fascinating.
And I think like a lot of LGBT storytelling is communal, and I think that there's a lot of people out there who, when they read a story about LGBT people who doesn't quite match up to their experience, because there is an expectation that you will kind of be able to link into it in some way, I think that's when people get a bit kind of confused. They're like, oh, but this doesn't quite match up with me. But like, if you look at the way that the community talks to it, like itself, in and of itself, there are like these little, I don't want to say stereotypes, but sort of they are, of like each sort of letter is like, oh, well, this is what these are things that like do that, you know, like bi people can't sit on chairs properly. Yeah. It's such a weird stereotype, but it's also not entirely not true.
You know, asexuals also love cake. So
yeah, they do.
And I do love cake.
Yeah. But they're little and they're harmless for the most part. And I think that is a large part of the community, and I think he's very cleverly, from what you've said, kind of linking into that idea of communal narrative, that we all kind of have these little things of like, I get that, I understand that, because there is a shared experience to a greater or lesser extent.
Oh yeah,
and it does exist.
And I think that it is that kind of way of, I would love to do a study one day, and maybe I will, maybe I should, the structure of LGBT communal storytelling, and the way, because it reminds me a lot of so this is going to be a bit of a stretch, but it is similar. I used to do research with new religious movements, and back in the day before I swapped to pop culture, and I was doing some research with Christian Scientists in Edinburgh. And Christian Science groups are like this kind of, it's a new religious movement that's kind of connected to Christianity. It's not Scientology. Everyone always thinks so for some reason. It's very different. But they have 2 different services every week. They've got a Wednesday and a Sunday. And Sunday is like if you showed up, you would just think it was any other Christian group, the way that it is. But on Wednesdays, it's a lot more focused on Christian Science teaching more specifically. And part of it is testimonials, which again is very similar to Quakers, where it's really quiet for a while. And if you feel it take you, you stand up and you talk about your experience, and particularly of the week, or if you experienced something. I was doing research on the structure of those testimonials and how even if you showed up, they would all feel really different, but that the way that they were constructed and the way that they tied into each other was actually very much like the same setup of structure, where it was, this was my experience, my very personal experience that very much relates to the exact situation that I found myself in. This is how it connects to the greater narrative of the community, and then how that reassessed my position and how I came out the other side in a different position.
Okay, so I can see the link between that kind of narrative, that and the LGBT. I can see it.
Yeah. So and this is what I found, not doing any kind of actual scientific study anymore, but just looking at the stories and being in the stories often, that you find yourself doing the same thing of going, well, this is my personal experience. That might not be your personal experience, but this is my personal experience. But this connects to the wider ideas much more broadly of the letters and the way that we more broadly experience things. And then that comes back to the way that I've reassessed my position in relationship to the community. I know personally it took me a really long time to identify as LGBT, even when I found out that I was asexual, because I didn't feel like I connected to the community, because I knew people who were trans, I knew people who were gay, who had struggled a lot more in society than I felt I had.
Yeah.
And so I felt like I didn't have a claim over it because of it didn't have a struggle element. But I think that's a very poor way of understanding it, and obviously I really wish that people wouldn't identify it purely through pain, there's other elements to it.
The LGBT community, I mean, there's issues within the trans community, particularly talking about that you can only be trans if you suffer from almost very severe body dysphoria, and that's just entirely not true. But that's because some people, that's the only way they can identify their own experience, and therefore everyone else's experience must be the same. And I think that happens a lot with the community. I have seen the discourse about asexual people not being part of it, and I'm except of course they are. Don't be ridiculous. We live
that's
in a
what
world
the A
where
stands
sex,
for.
yeah, and also we live in a world where sex is almost the be all and end all of most of what people talk about. It's made jokes about it. It's in adverts all the time. So actually, just because it's a different approach, but it's not, and it's a different way of thinking, it's a different way of being, but it's still as equally valid within the community. And I say this to somebody on the asexual spectrum myself, I am coming from that place. There is a validity to it that I think if you're you're homosexual, you're gay, you're lesbian, or you're bi, there is it's a different experience. It's very different. But they're equally as valid as each other. Personally, I'm very much everybody get along, let's have a nice time, big queer family, But then there'd be people who'd be don't use the word queer at me, and I'm oh my god, okay, everybody's experience is different. Let's try and be nice to each other. Maybe that's I'm like that all the time though. I'm like everybody get along, please. Which can't always happen. But it is a really interesting thing to see somebody tell stories that can be connective tissue for everybody, whether it's their story or not. And it is a very broad way of looking at things while being incredibly personal at the same time. So
yeah. I know there was a particular song of Orville's on Pony that was about... again, this is going to be very specific to being gay, which is about when you are openly gay, but the person you're with isn't, so you have to hide the fact that you're in a relationship, and how a lot of gay men feel used in a way because they can't be open while the other person is closeted, but at the same time it's not your place to out someone if they're not ready to be out. So the very complicated inner workings of that, which I personally won't understand because I haven't experienced it, but yet I understood it from somebody who has heard those stories time and time again, and I can understand someone hearing that and understanding what that feels like to them. And again, you get that cycle of storytelling of, this is Orville's story, that he is in many ways doing that same structure, and then somebody listening to it and understanding that's a part of that wider community story that I can then connect my personal experience to, and it becomes this web of stories that I think is really beautiful.
Clearly, I am converted. I'm going to go and have to go and listen and cry.
Yes!
I'll just be there like, why would you do this? Why? I'll be in a puddle outside in the dirt, like, ugh. My little queer body just not able to cope with that.
It's so good. And I think Bronco, I find I prefer to Pony in a lot of ways, but I don't know if that's because it's much more broadly about depression more generally, and that's something that I can connect to.
This is such a fun thing to talk about.
But I also found a lot of the music a lot more upbeat. Not all of them, because I think my favorite songs of his are not the upbeat ones on Bronco, but I think it helps to not lull you into that constant state of dread. Yeah.
So I think I might need to wait until I finish writing my book, because while I was writing my second book, decided it would be really, really fun if I listened to Bo Burnham's Inside album on repeat for like 2 weeks. And my headspace after that was really not very good, shockingly. So we might wait until I'm done, and I'll give myself some time to digest it. Yeah, don't listen to hyper depressing albums. While even at like that album, that Bo Burnham album has some incredible bangers on it. But my goodness.
Maybe in the show notes I'll link to a song or two for people who just want to sample to find out whether or not they want to test out the water.
And we'll probably link to some discussions of LGBT storytelling and discussions of masks. Because I actually the idea of masks I would love to come back to at some point, because I think it's an incredible storytelling structure.
I've gone down rabbit holes with it. Not only from like the myth-telling perspective, I dabbled with it when I was doing my work on creepypasta, but working with cosplay, I see a lot of similarities with discussions of masks. So that will be a conversation for another day. Oh, but it'll definitely come up again.
Yeah, exactly. I have some friends who will literally only cosplay characters who have helmets or masks. And I'm like, that is so interesting to me, because like I feel like the whole thing is a mask, but for them it's the literal interpretation. But yes, it's a fascinating conversation, and we will talk about it within like actual real life people and narrative structure of stories, because I love talking about narrative structure. It's my job. I should hope I like talking. Like, Holly, you're a writer, you should really enjoy this. Yeah, it's good. Yeah, that and sentence structure, I'm a nerd. It's fine. Oh, this has been really fun. I've enjoyed this. It's very different to what we've done in the past. It's great.
Yeah, I always like to talk about fandoms. That I think when you say the word fandom, a lot of people think of things like, I mean, the stuff that we are fans of, like Tolkien and Pratchett and superheroes and video games, which we definitely talk about, because
nobody can see this, but I'm literally sat here wearing a Genshin Impact hoodie, so it's got ears.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, it's so cute. But you know, those things have a very different type. I think that all fandom has similarities, and you can cross-reference and all this sort of stuff, but it's nice to look at it from very different angles.
Yeah, so, I mean, I've definitely seen a lot of the fandom of Orville Peck and it's definitely very close fandom, and it has a lot of those really beautiful elements that we've talked about in fandom, of the joy of creativity, the joy of connection, the joy of finding like-minded people who live in societies and communities in the US that do not have as many LGBT people. They've been able to find others like them in this fandom. And I've seen people, there was one Reddit post on the Orville Peck subreddit that I really, really loved, where somebody was talking about how they have always wanted to wear a pink cowboy outfit. And they were wondering if it would be safe to do so at an Orville Peck concert. And of course, everyone was like, yeah, man, do it! But that's something that I think is so wonderfully beautiful and really shows that fandom aspect of people. You know, Orville wasn't in that conversation. He was just the thing that happened to bring these people together, or
but he kind of always is in the conversation, right?
Yeah, it's like he's always there.
He's always there.
He's always important, but in many ways is also unimportant, but also vastly important. It's really weird, but like
he's sort of the catalyst for it, and like obviously he will continue making music and do whatever and do what he wants to do and all that kind of stuff. But he has created a space and an environment he's sort of Little Big Bang, right? That he's been able to create that by being there. He is the catalyst for this community and these people to find each other, which is what all fandom is, right? You know, that something has to happen for people to want to come and grow their little garden of nerddom. That's a terrible analogy, but I don't care. I think we should end here before we go off into strange fandom analogy land. Okay.
Well, thank you for letting me talk about Orville Peck for the umpteenth time in my life.
I loved it. It was great. I feel like I've met a new community, and I'm going to go and, like I said, not quite yet.
Join us.
Give me a month, and once I've handed in, I'll be able to go and be depressing for a bit. Thank you very much for listening, guys. We'll be back soon if our schedule works.
If our uploading functions properly.
Yay!
Thank you for listening. Remember to like, review, and subscribe wherever you are listening to this podcast, and do give it a share. Tell your friends, family, fellow fans. Get the word out however you feel like you can. You can follow us on social media. Links are in the show notes, as well as some links to further reading for anyone who might be interested. Music for this episode was Nowhere Land by Kevin MacLeod, licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 3.0. This episode was produced by Vivian Asimos and Holly Swinyard.
Today. Oh no, what have I done?
I need to pull up the fucking intro script because I'm stupid and now I don't remember how it goes. Alright.
1 sec, I just spilled tea all over my desk. Oh, right.